Welcome everyone back to weekly weather updates, and in today's video we have the latest from the live radar. For the latest weather warnings, we do have a rain warning issued for southern areas over the next couple of days, as we are going to see some really heavy rain moving in from the south and the southwest. We've got a southerly tracking jet stream and it is going to cause a lot of heavy rain. We'll see that in more detail on the latest UKV, as it is looking really pretty abysmal for some southern areas over the rest of this working week. Things though into the weekend will dry up a little bit, but we start to see a bit of a battle between high pressure to our east, low pressure to our west, and it does mean the wind direction shifts to more of a southerly, which isn't terribly warm this time of year. Normally it would be quite warm in the summer months, but this time of year it's a little bit of a chilly pattern. We do see some slow moving areas of rain, so some areas might dry up into the weekend and start of next week. Other areas might actually get even wetter. Temperatures will be generally around average, a couple of degrees below or above in places, and a few overnight frost, but nothing too crazy. Longer term though, as we've alluded to over the last few videos, it does look like into the final week of January we are seeing an opening for another colder spell developing, and this one could be even more severe because it is looking most likely, if it does occur, to be coming from the east. The Scandinavian high is looking very favoured now as we do head towards the end of January. Scandinavian high doesn't always guarantee cold, because of course that cold could go elsewhere, could push into southern Europe, could stay up in Scandinavia, but we still have plenty of runs, including the GFS today, which really shows the beast getting unleashed into the final week or so of January, with bitterly cold air coming in from Siberia. As we'll see from the ensembles, they've not shifted that much, so it's not a favoured option. We've still got a lot of scatter into that final period, but we are seeing a huge spread, 25-degree temperature spread there as we head into the final days of January, between runs that don't develop the Scandinavian high and keep it milder, and those that do and bring in the -10 or even -15 isotherm. So things all to play for, but confidence is building in that window. We could be looking at some very cold air heading our way. So do remember, if you enjoy the video, you like and subscribe. And if you start on the live radar, you can see it is pretty unsettled through this evening. Spells of rain moving in and a bit of high-level snow, as we do have a bit of chillier, colder polar maritime air involved. But again, nothing too crazy, really only over some of the higher hills and mountains. But we are just going to continue to see unsettled conditions pushing in from the west as we have this southerly tracking jet. You can see rain down into central parts of France. The jet stream is diving through the Bay of Biscay, and we're in this trough, and that's why we're seeing lots of spells of rain. It's only going to get worse over the next few days, hopefully into the weekend and start of next week. It does settle a little bit. To look at the temperatures this evening, you can see it is relatively chilly further northwards. We've still got a bit of colder polar maritime air, but further southwards, milder areas moving in. And again, we'll have to see exactly how it does play out over the coming days, but we are expecting it to be kind of choppy and changing between above and below average. And if you look at the weather warnings, we do have a rain warning issued for Thursday from 9 a.m. until 10 p.m, as we are going to see further significant rain, 20 to 30 millimetres widely, 40 to 50 millimetres, as we see the rain coming in straight from the south with this big low pressure system pushing in. It did look pretty severe yesterday. There was the risk of some high level winds, but I don't think we're seeing that now, given no really changes in those warnings. But we could have said see a lot of heavy rain, could be really quite washout conditions there through Thursday. Now, if you look at the latest UKV, you can see that rain moving through this evening. Looks pretty unsettled, but it will move through quite quickly, and around midnight things should clear up. And then into Thursday morning, that heavy rain pushes in from the south. It looks miserable pretty much all day as this big wall of moderate to heavy rain moves through. Now, it did actually look a little bit heavier a couple of days ago, so we are fortunate from that perspective that it perhaps has lightened up a tad, but generally speaking, it still was looking like a horrible day there. Should clear into the evening, so by around midnight, most of that rain should be offshore. Showers pushing in for Friday, with slightly colder air mass once again, and you see it is a little bit dry, but still some showers in the west. Into the weekend, this is where we start to see that shift. You see the wind direction starts to change to more of a southerly or southeasterly. And this is because high pressure is trying to influence us from the east. And this is the beginning of that window opening for that colder potential into the final week of January. It's a really quite slow burner, at least initially, as that Scandinavian high doesn't develop in a couple of days. It's a good week or two of milling out to our east before moving more from sort of Central, Eastern Europe, more towards Scandinavia, that's when it could pull more of an easterly, or instead of what it's doing here, just kind of blocking the pattern, meaning we're not seeing cold air moving in, but we're seeing slow moving patterns and low pressure struggling to come into the Atlantic. And that's why the wind direction comes more from a southerly, and you can see the precipitation bands really struggle to push in here. And you can see they are coming up straight from the south. You see that from the mean sea level pressure, high pressure to the east, low pressure to the west, and it's this battle right over the top of us. So for some in the east, it might actually get quite dry through the weekend into the start of next week. But further westwards, it could be really quite abysmal with slower moving areas of rain. Now, if you look at the max temperatures, overnight tonight, pretty chilly. And into Thursday, we see the temperatures, again, around average, kind of 5 to 8 degrees. But of course, with that heavy rain, it's going to feel pretty cool. Into Friday morning, pretty cold start there, but again, not too unusual for the time of year to see frosts, a little bit milder further southwards. Into the afternoon, again, average temperatures kind of 5 to 9 degrees. Into Saturday, again, a little bit chilly further north and westwards, but not too bad in the south and the east, and 8 to 10 degrees there, so around average, and of course a little bit drier during the weekend, so might not be too bad there compared to what we've seen in the first 2 weeks of January. Into Sunday, a little bit of a chillier start in the north and west once again, and again, a bit of a battle there, kind of 6 to 10 degrees, so hovering again either side of average, and the same really for Monday. Colder start in the north, but further southwards, 8 to 10 degrees. So nothing too remarkable over the coming days, generally hovering around average, some longer spells of rain at times, and it turns a bit more slow moving into the weekend, start of next week, and some areas are drying up. But of course, this is fairly mundane compared to what we saw towards the end of 2025 and for much of the first kind of week or to 10 days of 2026. This is a relatively quieter period with no disruptive snow, nothing too crazy in terms of rain or wind, but still is fairly miserable. But we could be looking at another change into the final third of January, and that's what we're going to see here on the latest GFS. Now, the GFS has been very bullish once again with this easterly wind on its main operational run. It's pretty much exactly the same as yesterday's run, to be honest. Exactly the same kind of development and the same depth of cold pushing in as well. -10, if not even -15 isotherm moving through. So pretty good consistency from the GFS. Either it has gotten completely onto the wrong idea and we're going to see a big flip in the next kind of week or so, or it has gone on the train early and other runs will follow suit. Other runs are showing easterlies trying to develop, but they're just not as bullish and as confident with the depth of cold compared to the GFS. So you can see it here, the low pressure continues coming off the Atlantic, but you can see more of a block develops to our east. But it's across Central and Eastern Europe, not forcing an easterly wind or a strong easterly wind our way in the coming days. So we do already have a Scandinavian high developing, but you see it's not really tapping into anything cold. We're kind of in moderate, mild, mid-European air. It'll be chilly because at the surface, we'll see the temperatures cool down. It's pretty dry air, so again, we could see frosts, but we're not going to see anything too crazy there. But the Scandinavian high keeps going, and it pushes further and further northwards, and eventually, come the latter portion of next week, we start to draw in some colder air. Now, it's nothing crazy, but it is chillier and would allow frosts and maybe a little bit of winteriness, but it wouldn't be guaranteed, and it wouldn't be a beast from east or anything. But we run it on another couple of days. The Scandinavian high continues to build, continues to strengthen, and it means that cold air that isn't too abundant in the next few days starts to get drawn in from Siberia. And eventually, into the final 5 or 6 days of the month, we draw that depth of cold in, that big cold pool, -10, if not -15 isotherm pushing in. Some milder air trying to get involved. Again, could be seeing some heavy snow, and that easterly just continues right towards the end of the run, keeping it very blocked. The high pressure could collapse a little bit, which could reduce the depth of cold or the availability of that depth of cold, but at least for kind of 3, 4, 5 days there towards the latter portion of January, we are absolutely freezing as the beast is unleashed. And we can see that from the temperature deviation. It is absolutely bitter, that air drawing in. Potential equivalent temperature, absolutely frigid as well. And we would be looking at pretty widespread, heavy snowfall. You see quite a widespread snowfall, snow covering there. And again, probably see a lot more convection than this is showing in reality. But as I said, GFS is pretty bullish. Most runs are developing that Scandinavian high, but are not going for a full-blown beast from the east like the GFS. They're more moderate or not quite pulling it in their time frame. And that is exactly where the GEM is. You can see it's very similar to the GFS, low pressure diving southwards, Scandinavian high building in through this weekend, but not really having much of an impact, except slowing the weather systems down and potentially providing some dry conditions into next week. You see more of a high pressure influence into the middle of next week. And then as we head towards day 10, we see the Scandinavian high pushing northwards, the depth of cold increasing to our east, and eventually you can see that abyssally cold air is heading our way. Now, it's not quite the depth of cold the GFS had. It's not as big as a colder air mass, but nonetheless, we would be seeing absolutely frigid Arctic air moving in if we were to run this on another couple of frames. You can see the Scandinavian high is there, right up to our north, and we are seeing that easterly tucking in. So the GM shows the Scandinavian high building in from this weekend, so I wouldn't be surprised if next week, even though a lot of models, forecasters and a lot of like the BBC Weather, Met Office aren't really talking about this yet because it's still a little bit away, but I wouldn't be surprised if next week turns into a relatively cold week. Not snowy, not icy, massive wintry hazards, but I wouldn't be surprised if it turned pretty chilly with this high pressure system building in. Again, the upper air temperatures are not that cold, but inversion would take place at the surface if we do zoom in and we go back a couple of frames with this high involved. Overnight temperatures would start to drop away in daytime. Look at that, only 5, 6, 7 degrees. So I wouldn't be surprised once those high resolution runs get on to kind of the middle of next week. Once we look at the UKV in a few days' time, I wouldn't be surprised if it's looking pretty cold and frigid next week. Nothing crazy, but perhaps it could be similar to, as I said yesterday, to what we saw at the end of December, where it was cold. It was, it felt wintry, but it wasn't. We were just under high pressure, seeing an inversion with a bit of a slight easterly flow. And it could be the precursor to something absolutely freezing cold there to arrive into the final week of January. Now, do look at the latest ECMWF. It is just running as I am recording this video. So we've currently got out to day 10, but actually, no, it's just refreshing. We have got it out to day 15. So I'll be very interested to see what this shows. I've not looked at beyond day 10, so it'll be intriguing to see what it shows. So yes, high pressure building in. We start to see that low staying in from the west, so perhaps not as much of an influence from the high initially next week, so perhaps not agreeing with what the GM and the GFS was showing, which is more of a frigid next week. This is showing pretty unsettled and cool pattern with low pressure more involved. But we run it on another few frames. That high pressure system is firmly in control above towards Scandinavia. That easterly wind starts to push in, and we get very close to pulling in the beast. You can see we do get some very cold air in, but we're more under the high pressure influence. So although temperatures would absolutely plummet, and we've got this huge cold ball, even bigger than the GFS, to our east, because that high, in the way it's orientated, we've not got the lower heights pushing in. It'd be very cold, but might not be terribly wintry. Maybe further south and eastwards, definitely high chance of wintriness, but you can see those yellows do collapse a little bit, and we don't pull in these much lower heights. If we were to see a true beast from east, heavy snow showers packing in like we saw in 2018, we'd want to be seeing more of these blues moving through, which is similar to what the GFS was showing. You can see that with the greens and blues coming in from the east. You can see perhaps not terribly low heights, but is much lower heights there pushing in. So it'd be a lot more in the way of heavy snow showers compared to the ECMWF, with the high pressures a little bit more over the top of us. So very, very interesting. All three runs getting that big cold pool heading our way. The GM, yes, it doesn't quite get to the time frame where it actually can pull in, but both the ECMWF and the GFS in slightly different capacities do pull in that -10 isotherm and do turn us exceptionally cold there into the final few days, or perhaps even 5, 6, 7 days of January. So very, very interesting from the runs today. I wouldn't be surprised if this does get pushed back a little bit. Sometimes the runs, as we saw at the end of December, a bit progressive. We thought originally the cold air would be arriving the days after Christmas. It arrived about 4 or 5 days later into the first couple of days of 2026. So I wouldn't be surprised if maybe this was more the last few days of January and more into early February. But there is a strong signal here for a Scandinavian high building in, strongest I've seen in quite a long time, perhaps going back many years. So yeah, we could be on board for another significant cold spell towards the end of January and start of February, and we are just now seeing those preliminary runs starting to show it. Now I continue to caveat and continue to say potential, because you can see we have got a lot of support from the ensembles, but it's not unanimous. We haven't got every run showing it. The next week, out towards the 20th, 22nd, it looks fairly mundane. Temperatures around average, hovering either side. You can see it does turn a little bit drier next week, as the GFS was showing in its operational run. High pressure more involved, even though the upper air temperatures look mild, wouldn't be surprised if it's actually pretty cold at the surface. And then around the 22nd, 23rd, we start to see cold runs appearing, and then very cold runs appear to the final 4 or 5 days of the month, including the operational, which is exceptionally cold. Yes, it is one of the coldest runs, like it was yesterday, but it has got numerous runs going to a similar level. So it's not a complete outlier, but it is definitely on the lower end of the ensemble spectrum. We can see from the 2 meter temperatures, next week it is looking chilly. Monday, 6 or 7 degrees is looking like the best temperature. Come Wednesday, look at that, 3, 4, 5 degrees, which again isn't very cold. It's not bitterly cold, nothing like the start of January, but it's more like what we saw around Christmas, where it was chilly, it was icy, frosty mornings. We could see something like that developing quite sneakily next week, with that high pressure getting a bit more and more strength every day. And you can see just as generally longer term, it's looking like even if we don't pull in that bitterly cold air like the GFS shows, it looks below average there by a couple of degrees to end the month, with temperatures around the mid to low single digits. And again, there'll be quite harsh frost with the high pressure involved. That's the one thing we are fairly certain on, is that Scandinavian high building. It's just the orientation and the depth of cold, really, that runs are disagreeing with. That signal for that high to our northeast, as I said, is one of the strongest signals I've seen in many, many years. It's in the 2010s, let's just say. So, yeah, it is definitely looking like a very interesting next couple of weeks, not only for actual weather, but also for the model watching. You see the sea level pressure, if this does load, is generally moderate to high. Again, pretty typical, with more of a slower moving pattern with a Scandinavian high. No deep lows moving in at all from the ensembles here. A few weird runs in the longer term showing it, proper outliers. Most though are high pressure dominated, which again indicates continental colder airflows, even if they're not bitterly cold. And the dew points, which is sometimes the most important thing. Look at that, the dew points are really cold from around the 21st, 22nd, so from around mid to early next week onwards, the dew points are low. So frosts, fog, ice could be coming back quite quickly into next week. We've had perhaps 4 or 5 days respite. It's going to be frosty at times this week, but we're not going to see the widespread ice like we saw last week. But it could be coming back as early as next week, with those dew points dropping, indicating cold, dry air, and that would mean cold nights. Now, if you look at the ECMWF to finish off, now unfortunately the midday run is only just running, so we can't really have a look at that. But if we look at the midnight run, it is fairly similar. We've got a big drop off longer term with some very cold runs appearing, perhaps not quite as bullish, perhaps around the 22nd, 23rd, 24th. So perhaps again goes along with that a little bit of intuition. I thought, this might just get pushed back a few days, might be more final few days of January and more early February than sort of early 20s of January, like some runs are proposing. So yes, some real intrigue over the next couple of weeks. Definitely looks like it is going to be turning colder and drier, with that high pressure being more of an influence to our east. But could we really unleash something more severe, something we've perhaps not seen in many, many years from the east? Not seen a proper easterly for many years. I think maybe February 2021, I believe, we saw a proper easterly. Now, of course, it was kind of early to mid-February, so we'll get to the point of the year where the sun was a bit strong, so we didn't see as much snowfall from it, and it was more exclusive in eastern areas, and we saw, I think it was, I can't remember exactly, but there was a named storm beginning with D. I do remember that back in 2021. That was probably the last severe easterly we've seen, where we've got, proper bitterly cold air up and down the country. Minus 10 isotherm moved in really cold dew points, and that lasted about 5 or 6 days. A slightly different pattern to what this is showing. This is more showing a brutal, long-fetched easterly. That was more of an easterly after a bit of a northerly spell, a little bit of a collapsed northerly brought then an easterly as that high pressure hung on. So it's a slightly different pattern, but that's the last time we saw something really quite severely cold from the east. And yeah, we could be looking at something as bad, if not worse, as we do head into the next few weeks, and we'll keep a very close eye on it. So anyway, thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed subscribing new, and I'll see you again for another video soon.